It's interesting to see the damage control that people are doing in regards to the current situation at Capcom, Square Enix, and what was the other company? There was some other major third party, but anyway, the major Japanese third party studios, all of them are losing a bunch of money. They have been for a long time, and the thing that everyone loves to do whenever they notice this, like, oh, it's because of woke culture, it's because of the SJWs, it's because of ESG pandering, it's because of this and that, it's because of woke. That has been the go-to excuse for most people for the past several years or so. And it is completely and totally wrong. Most people aren't even aware that Japanese developers are compromised. Most people don't know that Tekken 8 has been stripped down and has been like overly monetized and has done like all this stuff. Most people don't know about Final Fantasy 16 and like Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth and like the lesbian couple. Like most people don't know any of this because nobody is buying the games. Okay, what does that tell you? What does that tell you about the current state of third-party developers, right? They go woke over the past couple of years. People don't buy the games because the real reason they don't buy the games is because they're not available on the market leader, Nintendo Switch. Third parties fucked around and found out. Like, oh, we're going to do what we did during the Wii generation. We're just going to throw all of our support at PlayStation, Xbox, and PC and just see the sales for those consoles explode and all the mature games for mature gamers that come out on those platforms. Yeah, all of that revenue has dried up. Why? Because people aren't bamboozled by high visual graphics and mediocre plots anymore, right? Back in the day, you used to be able to coast off of marketing firms and game journals trying to tell you that, like, oh, FemShep, she's one of the best characters in all of gaming. Yeah, as if. FemShep is such an irrelevant character that 90% of the player base played as her male counterpart, right? Like, FemShep was never a big deal. Right? Just like how BioShock wasn't all that well executed, or Portal wasn't all that good, or, these games were running off of fumes even in the mid-2000s, right? Like, again, these games were all hype and no substance. And all that's happened is that people have started to see through the smoke and mirrors and realize that, like, wow, I can have way more fun playing a port of a 10-year-old Nintendo game, Luigi's Mansion 2, Donkey Kong Country Returns, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, just to name a few examples. I can have way more fun with a decade-old Wii game than I would ever have playing the newest Capcom or Square Enix slop, right? That is what's happening, is that the industry has finally woken up and realized that, like, the Nintendo hardware is superior, right? The community is rallying behind Nintendo games to the point where, like, even get titles like Famicom Detective Club and Live Alive and 13 Sentinels are, like, massive hits on Nintendo Switch, right? Games that would have bombed on any other platform are huge on Nintendo Switch, right? We have Xenoblade, we have Fire Emblem, we have, like, Pikmin, right? Metroid is bigger than it's ever been, right? And it's just gonna keep escalating from here. Like, people have this delusional mindset of, like, oh, Nintendo's gonna fall off by the next console. The next console isn't gonna be anywhere near as Hey, genius. Nintendo is an established brand now. You are never going to be able to convince people that Nintendo is going to go out of business the way you did in the mid-2000s, right? Sony and Microsoft completely and utterly failed to dominate Nintendo by outspending them. That's what this all comes down to. People complain about the horsepower for the Switch. Yeah, because having more powerful hardware is more expensive, right? Like, people complain about, like, the Joy-Cons. Yeah. Nintendo has created an ecosystem that is simultaneously a traditional video game platform and a handheld with motion controls, right? Like I remember growing up being told, like screamed at near constantly, that nobody loves motion controls, nobody likes motion controls. What happens? Nintendo Switch has motion controls. It has games that feature motion controls, and although people still try to cry about them the way they used to, it's not nearly as effective, right? WarioWare Move It and Nintendo Switch Sports were huge, huge successes, right? Like people don't realize how much of how Nintendo is dominating those genres now. Like it isn't something that just ended with the Wii, like so many people like to make out to be. Like Nintendo is simply like dominating the gaming industry. They always have, but it's becoming more and more difficult to deny that, to the point where people are beginning to realize, like investors are starting to ask questions. Like Game Journals did a hit piece on Capcom investors a while back because someone came up and asked, like, why are you not developing Wilds for Switch? Monster Hunter Wilds for Switch. And there was like the usual damage control and the cope, like, oh, Nintendo couldn't run that game. But Capcom had great success putting Monster Hunter 3 on Nintendo platforms. It was Nintendo exclusive for a long time, right? World was an anomaly, right? They put like all this money on all this marketing, all this budget into getting it to come out on like the real gaming platforms, right? They abandoned Nintendo hardware, and they put out Rise, like to do what I think they always do, where they put out like the low budget, like low effort slop on Nintendo hardware, like hoping that it doesn't become popular and that it drives people away from the Nintendo brand and towards other platforms. But instead what happens is that like Rise was actually better than World, and people have to cope and seethe about that, right? Like going into the release of Wilds, it's really interesting kind of seeing like the attempts at establishing a narrative, right? The attempts at pretending Rise was disappointing and that World was great, when like really nobody cares about World at all, and Rise was fantastic. Like again, what exactly does Monster Hunter Wilds do that makes it impossible to run on Nintendo Switch? What does Elden Ring do that makes it impossible to run on Nintendo Switch, right? What does Baldur's Gate 3 do? What does Street Fighter 6 do? What does Tekken 8 do? Like, what do any of these games do that makes them completely impossible to run on Nintendo hardware, right? The answer is nothing, right? If Nintendo is the market leader, if it's the console that people are actually playing, these companies should be releasing all of their games on Nintendo hardware first. There is no reason to prioritize less popular, irrelevant platforms like Xbox, PlayStation, and PC. But they keep doing it anyway because they know the instant that Nintendo establishes their market dominance, they aren't going to be able to pull the same stunts they have been, right? It was Microsoft that introduced paid online play and DLC and like the battle pass system, right? Like instead of making fun, interesting video games, all these companies want to do is exploit you. And under the Nintendo ecosystem, where they can't really do that, suddenly they're just not going to remain competitive. And what's more, all the money that they make on Nintendo platforms is going to go straight into Nintendo's pocket. It will be completely impossible to compete with Nintendo if these companies primarily have to compete with their software on their own hardware, right? Because, 25 million units sold of Elden Ring on Nintendo Switch, that money is just going to go straight into making the next Zelda game, even better than it would have already been already. Like, it's been a losing battle for a long time. I would argue it always has been, even back in the Super Nintendo days with the Sega Genesis, right, which coasted entirely on like its trippy ad campaigns and not actually having games. Like again, all game journos and the industry were doing were tricking you into thinking that Nintendo consoles were somehow inferior, when in reality, blast processing is not a real thing, right? In reality, FMV doesn't magically make games better. Like, having discs over cartridges, it has no real tangible benefit whatsoever. The PlayStation controller was objectively inferior to the N64 one, to the point where they had to re-release a DualShock later on to compete with the Nintendo's innovation with the N64 controller, right? Motion controls were great, right? Motion controls revolutionized the entire industry, and now we're at this point where games that spend like over a decade getting produced can't compete with like the newest Mario game, right? Like again, it's really interesting seeing people flail about and try to say like the Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom bombed or Super Mario Bros. Wonder bombed, while like venerating crap like Final Fantasy 16 or Baldur's Gate 3 or Elden Dingaling, right? Like, what? None of these games are going to be remembered like 5 years from now. Like, honestly, it feels like Elden Ring is kind of getting forgotten now. I'm kind of shocked at how many people like outside of the core Elden Ring audience seem to really like have a lot of contempt for the game and like the elitist attitude for the fans. And I do think it's going to implode in the next decade or so. That like the FromSlot thing is going to stop being trendy, and then like what are you going to have? Like you're not getting another Baldur's Gate. Like not that was popular to begin with, but like again, what are you going to have 10 years from now? What are you looking forward to aside from a bunch of games that really should be on Nintendo platforms anyway? Like, what exactly are you looking forward to?